The rain outside the monolith of Sterling Cross Holdings was cold, but the atmosphere inside the lobby was sub-zero. Julian Vane, the youngest hedge fund manager to ever grace the cover of Fortune, stood in the center of the marble floor. His tailored charcoal suit didn't have a single crease, and his watch cost more than a suburban home. He wasn't just a man, he was a brand. "You're telling me," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous purr, "that my pre-market briefing isn't ready because you had a family emergency." Clara, a middle-aged woman in a faded cleaning uniform, stood before him. She was clutching a mop bucket, her knuckles white. "Mr. Vane, my son was rushed to surgery. I only left my post for 20 minutes to answer the hospital's call. I've worked here for 15 years. You've occupied space here for 15 years, Julian interrupted, stepping into her personal space. He took his lukewarm latte and, with a slow, deliberate motion, tipped it over. The brown liquid splashed across Clara's worn shoes and the pristine floor she had just polished. "There. Now you have something to actually work on. After that, hand in your badge. You're done." The lobby, filled with ambitious interns and stone-faced security, went silent. It was a classic display of power, the titan crushing the ant. Julian turned his back, already dismissing her existence, when the heavy, revolving doors hissed open. A man walked in. He didn't wear a suit. He wore a simple, dark navy mechanic's jacket with a small grease stain on the collar. He looked like a man who worked with his hands, someone Julian wouldn't even notice on the street. But as the man's boots clicked against the marble, the lead head of security, a man who usually looked like he could swallow a grenade, suddenly went pale. He stood at attention, his hand dropping from his holster. The stranger didn't look at Julian. He walked straight to Clara. He took the mop from her hand and set it aside. "I told you to take the day off, Clara," the man said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that seemed to anchor the entire room. Julian spun around, his face reddening. "Who the hell are you? This is a private floor." "Security, get this vagrant out of here!" The security team didn't move. They stayed frozen, looking at the floor. The man in the navy jacket finally turned to Julian. He didn't look angry, he looked bored. "You must be Julian. I've read your reports. You're very good at math, but you're terrible at history." "I don't care who you think you are," Julian snapped, stepping forward. "I own 10% of the equity in this building. I am the reason this firm is profitable." The stranger tilted his head. "You own 10% of the operating equity, but you don't own the land. You don't own the debt. And as of 3 minutes ago, you don't own a job." The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a single, battered leather wallet. He didn't show a badge. He showed a small, ancient brass key, the kind used for the private elevators that led to the penthouse suites no one was allowed to visit. "My name is Arthur Sterling," the man said quietly. The blood drained from Julian's face. The Sterling of Sterling Cross hadn't been seen in public for a decade. He was a ghost, a myth, the man who owned the very air Julian breathed. "I spent my morning under a car in my garage because I like things that work," Arthur said, stepping toward Julian. Julian instinctively backed away, tripping over the mop bucket he had forced Clara to use. He fell, his expensive suit soaking up the cold coffee he had poured moments ago. Arthur looked down at him. "Clara didn't just occupy space for 15 years. She was my late father's primary nurse. She's family. And you?" Arthur looked at the security head. "Escort Mr. Vane out. He can keep the suit. He's going to need it for the interviews he won't be getting." As Julian was hauled away, the invisible worker stood tall, and the mysterious outsider picked up the mop. The power hadn't just shifted. It had returned to its rightful owner. The gold-plated clock in the executive lounge of the Sterling Heights Hotel ticked with a heavy, rhythmic thud. It was the only sound in the room after the slap. Elias Thorne, the prince of real estate, stood over a young waiter who was currently on his knees, frantically dabbing at a red wine stain on Elias's white Italian leather shoes. Elias didn't look down with pity. He looked down with the cold, calculated disgust one might show a cockroach. "That stain," Elias whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying calm, "costs more than your life is worth. Do you even know who I am?" The waiter, a kid barely out of college named Leo, stammered an apology. But Elias wasn't looking for apologies. He was looking for an outlet. He raised his hand for a second strike, the high society crowd around them turning their heads away, unwilling to lose their invitations to Elias's next gala. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the lounge swung open. A man walked in. He wasn't dressed for a gala. He wore a heavy, grease-stained denim jacket and work boots that left dusty tracks on the plush cream carpet. He looked out of place, a smudge of dirt on a polished diamond. Elias's hand stayed frozen in midair. His face, usually a mask of bronze tan and arrogance, turned a sickly shade of gray. The wine glass in his other hand began to tremble, the liquid sloshing against the rim. He didn't yell for security. He didn't demand to know who the intruder was. He simply stopped breathing. The man in the denim jacket didn't head for the bar. He didn't look at the expensive art. He walked straight toward the center of the room, his eyes locked on Elias with a terrifying, silent familiarity. "Drop the hand, Eli," the man said. His voice was gravelly, sounding like a man who hadn't spoken in years. Elias's hand fell to his side like a broken branch. "You're supposed to be in Oregon," Elias managed to choke out. "I paid for you to stay in Oregon." The stranger reached the circle of light and looked down at Leo, the waiter. "Get up, kid. This man isn't worth your knees." He reached out a hand, calloused, scarred, and powerful, and pulled the waiter to his feet. The curiosity gap in the room was a physical weight. The elite guests whispered. Who was this man? Why was the most powerful man in the city acting like a terrified child? What was the Oregon Elias mentioned? The man turned back to Elias. He reached into his denim jacket and pulled out an old, yellowed blueprint. He threw it onto the table, right into the puddle of spilled red wine. "The Thorne Plaza," the stranger said, pointing at the blueprint. "The design that made you Architect of the Year. The one that launched this whole empire while I was sitting in a cell for a hit and run you committed." The room gasped. The secret was out. The stranger wasn't an intruder. He was the ghost of the past. He was Silas, the older brother. The man who had been the real architect, the one who had designed every building Elias took credit for, while Silas served a sentence for his brother's crime. "I didn't come for the money, Eli," Silas said, stepping into Elias's personal space until their chests touched. "I came because I heard you started hitting people who can't hit back. I took a fall for a brother, not a monster." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small remote. He pressed a button. Across the room, the massive digital stock ticker showing Thorne Global began to plummet. "The Oregon money you sent me? I didn't spend it," Silas whispered. "I used it to buy the debt on this hotel. You're standing in my building now, and you're wearing my shoes." Elias looked around, but the friends who had been laughing with him moments ago were already moving away, their phones out, recording his ruin. The status had reversed. The king was a fraud, and the man in the grease-stained jacket was the only one left with any power. Silas looked at his brother one last time. "Clean up the wine, Eli. It's your floor now." As Silas walked out, the doors swung shut, leaving Elias Thorne alone in the middle of a room that no longer belonged to him. The penthouse gala was a sea of silk and hollow laughter, a celebration of Marcus Thorne's Visionary of the Year award. Marcus stood at the center, radiating the kind of polished confidence that only $1 billion can buy. He was the golden boy of the tech world, a man who claimed to have built an empire from a garage with nothing but a dream. In the corner of the room, Elena, the girl who had actually written the code that launched that empire, was serving hors d'oeuvre. She wore the black and white uniform of the catering staff, her eyes downcast. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was a ghost in her own story. 10 years ago, she and Marcus had been partners. Then, a security breach had occurred. A massive data theft that threatened to sink the company. Marcus had looked her in the eye and told her he would handle it. Instead, he had planted the evidence in her station and handed her to the feds. Elena didn't fight it, not because she was guilty, but because her brother, Cassian, had stepped in. Cassian, who had a record from his youth and knew the system would chew Elena up, made a deal. He confessed to a crime he didn't understand to keep his sister's future bright. He went to prison. Elena went to the shadows, blacklisted from the industry she helped build. And Marcus went to the top. The moral stakes were never about the money. They were about the 10 years of life Cassian had lost in a concrete box while Marcus bought yachts. The emotional resonance hit its peak when Marcus, slightly drunk on success, spotted Elena. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't even offer a check. He leaned in and whispered, "You should be grateful, Elena. If I hadn't sent Cassian away, you'd be the one in the cell. Now, be a good girl and bring me another drink." He reached out to pat her cheek, a gesture of pure, condescending ownership, but his hand never reached her. A grip like a steel vice clamped around Marcus's wrist. The air in the room seemed to vanish. A man stood there, tall and lean, with a jagged scar running along his jawline and eyes that looked like they had been forged in a furnace. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a simple black t-shirt that showed the tattoos of a man who had survived a decade of hell. Marcus's face went from flush to chalk. "Cassian, you're out? They said you had 2 more years." "Good behavior," Cassian said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that silenced the music. "And a very talented lawyer who found a server in Switzerland you forgot to wipe, Marcus." The betrayal versus loyalty theme was no longer an abstract concept. It was standing in the center of the room. Cassian didn't strike him. He didn't need to. He simply turned Marcus's hand over, revealing the expensive watch. "This watch was bought with my time," Cassian said. "This building was built with my sister's mind. You've been living in a house made of our sacrifices." Cassian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. He didn't give it to Marcus. He handed it to a prominent investigative journalist standing nearby. "The real code," Cassian said, looking at the reporter, "and the logs showing exactly who moved the files 10 years ago." Marcus lunged for the drive, but Cassian didn't even flinch. He simply stepped in front of Elena, a human shield made of a decade of unresolved justice. Marcus tripped over his own feet, falling onto the catering table. The visionary of the year was covered in cheap champagne and appetizers, looking up at the man he had betrayed. "You have 10 minutes before the police arrive, Marcus," Cassian said, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with the cold finality of a debt being collected. "I'd suggest you enjoy the view. It's the last time you'll see the sky without bars in front of it." Cassian turned to Elena, his hard expression softening into the first smile she had seen in 10 years. He took the serving tray from her hands and set it on the floor. "Let's go, sis," he said. "We've got a lot of time to make up for." As they walked out of the penthouse, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The moral stakes had been settled. The loyalty of a brother had outlasted the betrayal of a king. And for the first time in a decade, Elena breathed the air of a woman who was no longer a ghost. The boardroom of Vora Logistics felt more like a courtroom. At the head of the mahogany table sat Silas Vora, a man whose ego was as inflated as his stock price. "You're a delivery driver, Maya," Silas sneered, flicking a stray piece of lint off his $5,000 blazer. "Your job is to drop the package and disappear. Not to ask for a signature from a man of my stature." Maya stood her ground, her reflective vest glowing under the harsh LED lights. "The protocol for high-value shipments requires a biometric signature, sir. If I don't get it, the system locks the delivery." Silas didn't answer with words. He rose, walked over, and with a sharp, lightning-fast motion, shoved Maya backward. She hit the floor, the heavy handheld scanner skidding across the polished marble. "There's your signature," he spat. "Now get out before I have security throw you out of the window you probably used to break into this tax bracket." He turned back to his board members, laughing. But the laughter died in his throat. The heavy double doors didn't just open, they were thrown wide. A man stepped in, wearing a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit with the name KL stitched over the heart. He didn't look at the billionaires. He looked at Maya, who was still on the floor. "Did he touch you, Maya?" Kale asked. His voice was like grinding stones, heavy, low, and immovable. Silas straightened his tie, regaining his arrogance. "Who is this? Some grease monkey from the loading dock? Security!" Kale didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room, pulling a sleek, black, encrypted tablet from his pocket. He didn't look like a mechanic anymore. He looked like an executioner. "The security team is busy, Silas. I just remotely wiped their authorization codes, along with yours." The tactical pacing of the room shifted. This wasn't a conversation. It was an execution. "You think you're a self-made titan," Kale said, tapping a command on the tablet. "But you forgot who built the engine. 20 years ago, we were kids in a garage. I designed the logistics algorithm that made this company a giant. You just stole the patents while I was serving time for the street racing accident you caused." Silas let out a jagged laugh. "That's a fairy tale. Those patents are legally mine. You have nothing. I have the back door," Kale countered. "I didn't just build the engine, Silas. I built a kill switch." On the massive 4K monitor behind Silas, the company's real-time valuation began to flicker. Red numbers cascaded down the screen like blood. Millions of dollars were vanishing every second as the proprietary algorithm began to delete itself. "What are you doing?" Silas screamed, lunging for the tablet. Kale didn't even move. He just stepped aside, letting Silas stumble over the same scanner Maya had dropped. "The board just received an anonymous tip," Kale said, looking at the horrified executives. "It contains the original source code with my digital signature embedded in the kernel, and the dashcam footage from 20 years ago that the police lost. It turns out, hit and runs don't have a statute of limitations when federal fraud is involved." Silas looked at the screen. The stock price hit zero. The Vora name was being erased from the server in real time. Kale reached down and helped Maya up. He didn't look back at the man screaming on the floor. "The car's out front, Maya. We're going to the precinct." "It's time Silas finally finishes the sentence I started for him." The brother and sister walked out, leaving the billionaire sitting in a silent room, surrounded by men who were already calling their lawyers to testify against him. The execution was complete. The rain outside the glass walls of the Sterling Plaza was a torrential downpour, turning the city into a blurred smudge of gray. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, cold and indifferent. Dominic Thorne stood in the center of the lobby, his $10,000 suit dry, his ego untouched. He had just won the court case. The woman standing across from him, Elena, was the lead engineer he had framed for corporate espionage to cover his own embezzlement. She had lost her career, her savings, and her reputation in a single afternoon. "You look tired, Elena," Dominic said, checking his platinum watch. "Maybe you should find a bridge to sleep under." "I hear the views are great this time of year," he laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed off the marble. He signaled for his driver, expecting his armored limousine to pull up to the curb. But the curb remained empty. A man stepped out of the shadows near the security desk. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a simple black hoodie, his face half hidden. He looked like the kind of person Dominic would usually have arrested just for standing too close. "Your car isn't coming, Dominic," the man said. His voice was calm, almost bored. Dominic sneered. "And who are you?" "Another one of Elena's witnesses who couldn't find the courthouse." The man pulled back his hood. It was Cassian, Elena's brother. He hadn't been at the trial because he had been busy elsewhere. He held up a smartphone, the screen glowing with a red notification. "I'm the guy who just took your buy rating to default," Cassian said. "While you were in court lying about my sister, I was in your server room. You shouldn't have used the same password for your personal cloud and the company's offshore ledger." Dominic's phone chirped. Then it buzzed. Then it began to vibrate incessantly. He pulled it out. "Bank of Zurich. Account drained. Global Equity. Margin call. Sterling Holdings. SEC freeze." "What did you do?" Dominic's voice cracked, the arrogance slipping like sand through his fingers. "I didn't do anything but open a door," Cassian said, stepping closer. "I sent the real ledgers, the ones showing the money you moved out of the pension fund, to the DOJ, the IRS, and every major news outlet in the country. Right now, your board of directors is voting to strip you of your shares. You don't own this building anymore, Dominic. You don't even own that watch." As if on cue, two security guards, men Dominic had personally hired, stepped forward. They didn't look at him with respect. They looked at him like trash. "Mr. Thorne," the lead guard said, "we've received orders from the interim board. You're to vacate the premises immediately. Your personal assets have been seized for the investigation." "You can't do this. This is my name on the building," Dominic screamed, lunging for Cassian. But Cassian simply stepped aside, letting the guards grab Dominic by the arms. They didn't lead him out gently. They dragged him. His expensive leather shoes scuffed against the floor. Elena had walked across in shame just hours ago. They reached the revolving doors and shoved. Dominic stumbled out into the freezing rain. He landed hard on the wet pavement. His suit was instantly soaked, the fine wool heavy and smelling of wet dog. He looked up. Through the glass, he saw Cassian hand Elena a folder, the original designs for the tech Dominic had stolen. She was back in the lobby. She was the one the staff were bowing to now. Dominic reached for his phone to call his lawyer, but the screen was dark. Remote wipe. He was a ghost in a city he used to rule. He sat there, shivering on the same curb where he had told Elena to find a bridge, while the neon lights of his own name flickered and died on the skyscraper above him. The ruin was total. The justice was silent. And as the rain washed away the last of his pride, the world moved on without him.